In this lecture, we're going to look at triggers in MySQL. A trigger is a block of SQL code that automatically gets executed before or after an insert, update, or delete statement. Quite often, we use triggers to enforce data consistency. For example, in our SQL Store database, we can have multiple payments towards a given invoice. Now, in this table, we have this payment total column, and the value that we have in this column should be equal to the sum of all the payments for this invoice. So whenever we insert a new record in the payments table, we should make sure that the payment total column in the invoices table gets updated. And this is where we use a trigger. Let me show you how to do this. So first, we need to change the default delimiter. Then we use the create trigger statement. We give our trigger a name, like payments after insert. And this basically means that this trigger is associated with the payments table and is fired after we insert a record. This is a convention that a lot of people use to name their triggers. So first we specify the table name, then we type after or before, and this indicates whether the trigger is fired after or before a SQL statement. And finally, we have the type of the SQL statement that will fire this trigger, okay? Now, this is just a name. It has no impact. So we should explicitly tell MySQL that we want this trigger to be fired after an insert statement on the payments table. So here we type after insert on payments. Here we could also use before. In this example, we're going to go with after. We could also use update or delete here, depending on what we're trying to implement. So let's go with insert. Next, we need to type for each row. And this means that this trigger gets fired for each row that is affected. So if we insert 5 rows, it will get triggered for each row. Now, some database management systems also support table level triggers that get fired only once. So if we insert 1 row or 5 rows, the trigger gets fired only once. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this, MySQL doesn't support this. Now we type begin and end to indicate the body of this trigger. And obviously here we need to type our new delimiter and then change it back to a semicolon. Now here in the body of this trigger, we can write any SQL code to modify our data for consistency. We can write raw SQL here or call a stored procedure. Now in this example, we're going to update the invoices table and increase the payment total amount. So we set payment underline total to payment total plus. Now we need to get the new value, the new payment amount. So here we use the new keyword, and this returns the row that was just inserted. We also have the old keyword, and this is useful when we are updating or deleting a row. So the old keyword will return the old row with the old values. Now here we're going to use the new keyword, and using a dot, we can access individual attributes. In this case, amount. So just to clarify this, take a look at the payments table. In this table, we have the amount column. So whenever we insert a new record in this table, then using new.amount, we can access the amount of this new payment, okay? Next, we need to add a where clause. We want to update a particular invoice, right? So where invoice ID equals, once again, we use the new keyword to get the invoice ID. And finally, we terminate this with a semicolon. Now, just one thing before we test our new trigger. In this trigger, we can modify data in any tables except the table that this trigger is for. Otherwise, we'll end up with an infinite loop because this trigger will fire itself. So we can modify data in any tables except this table here. All right, now let's create our new trigger. Beautiful. So back to our invoices table. Look at invoice with the ID 3. On my machine, the payment total is 0. I'm going to make a $10 payment towards this invoice, and then I'm going to come back here. I expect the payment total to be updated automatically. So let's open a new query window and insert into the payments table. What values do we need here? Let's look at the columns. First, we need the payment ID. For this, I'm going to use default. So MySQL will generate an ID for us. For the client ID, I'm going to use 5. For invoice ID, I'm going to use 3. Then I'm going to use 2019 January 1st for the date. I'm going to use 10 for the amount, and finally 1 for the payment method. All right, let's execute this. Beautiful. Back to the invoices table. I'm going to refresh the result. Now you can see the payment total for this invoice was automatically updated. This is where our trigger kicked in. Now for your exercise, create a trigger that gets fired when we delete a payment. This trigger does the opposite of the trigger that we just created, so it should reduce the total payment amount. All right, first we need to change the default delimiter. Then we create a trigger called payments after delete. Here we type after delete on payments. For each row, this is what we're going to do, begin and end. Here we use the new delimiter and then change it back to a semicolon. Now in the body of this trigger, we want to update the invoices table and set the payment total amount, total, to payment total minus. Here we use the old keyword to get the values in the row that was deleted. So old.amount, where invoice ID equals old.invoice ID. As simple as that. Let's create this trigger. All right. Now, I'm going to create the payment that we just created. So this invoice number 3, its payment total should be updated to 0. Back to the navigator panel, let's look at the payments table. Scroll to the bottom. So here's the new payment that we created. On my machine, that's payment number 10, where I contributed $10 for invoice number 3. So in this window, I'm going to delete from payments where payment ID equals 10. Let's execute this statement. Beautiful. Now back to the invoices table. I'm going to refresh the result. You can see the payment total for this invoice is updated to 0.